Chapter 6 is all about learning. When we think of the definition of learning, it is a relatively permanent change in behavior and mental processes based on our experience. When it says relatively permanent, that means that these behaviors or habits people develop can be changed based on their experiences in the future. So there are three types of learning. There's classical conditioning. That's where two things are linked together to help us anticipate something. There's operant conditioning, when behavior choices result from a certain consequence, and observational learning, which is learning by seeing others do something rather than direct experience. So we're going to talk about all three of these types of learning in detail. First, let's start with classical conditioning. When we have classical conditioning, two things have to be paired together, and we call those things that are paired together an NS or neutral stimulus with things that are already naturally responsive, which we call an unconditioned stimulus or a conditioned response. So let's take a look at what that means. For example, Ivan Pavlov was a behavioral psychologist, and you may have heard the term Pavlovian dogs before. He wanted to see whether he could get dogs to respond the way he wanted them to. So he had to take something known as a neutral stimulus. It's neutral because it has no meaning to anybody, okay? So with the dogs, he thought, okay, if a dog sees a dish, if a dog sees a person bringing food, if the dog hears footsteps, these are all things that I can train a dog to respond to if I want to. A neutral stimulus does not automatically trigger a response. So Pavlov took a bell and he rang the bell, and the dog didn't do anything because to the dog, the bell meant nothing. But Pavlov knew if he wanted to train the dog to respond to the bell, he had to pair the bell with something that would create a response in the dog. So what's something that dogs naturally respond to? One of the main things is food, right? So the food is what we call an unconditioned stimulus because it is something that doesn't have to be taught that automatically creates a response. So when you hear the word conditioning, think of learning. So if it's unconditioned, it's unlearned stimulus. So the dog didn't learn to salivate to food. The dog just naturally salivates to food when it smells or sees or knows it's about to eat. Same way it is with some humans. Humans start to get hungry when they smell food in the area. So an unconditioned stimulus is an unlearned thing, such as food, and an unconditioned response is an unlearned response, something that just naturally happens. The dog salivates. But Pavlov wanted the dog to salivate to his bell. So what did he do? He had to take his neutral stimulus and pair it with an unconditioned stimulus, which we know is food, and the dog is salivating. At first, he rings the bell and gives the dog food. We know that the dog is salivating to the food, not the bell. But if he pairs those two things together over and over and over again, eventually, through conditioning, that neutral stimulus that meant nothing in the beginning will eventually become a conditioned stimulus, because the dog will learn, when I hear that sound, I'm going to get food. And the dog will have a conditioned response, which is to salivate from hearing the bell. Does that make sense? So our formal neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus through conditioning. And that's what classical conditioning is. There's also something called higher order conditioning. And when we have higher order conditioning, we are able to take what used to be our neutral stimulus that became our conditioned stimulus, and we can pair it with another thing we've also conditioned. So if Pavlov not only wanted his dog to respond to a bell, he could also get that dog to respond to a flashlight or anything else he wanted to condition. That would be considered higher order conditioning, because you've taken something that was once neutral and you've paired it with something else and created another conditioned response. As a conditioned response grows, and once a person or an animal has learned conditioning, let's just say you want that conditioning to go away. You can do something called extinction. And extinction will happen the same way conditioning did. If you want to extinguish a behavior, just start ringing that bell and not giving the dog food. After a while, the dog is going to realize, well, that bell doesn't mean anything to me. And the dog will stop responding to the bell. So that would be to extinguish the behavior. Spontaneous recovery occurs when, after a period of time of no conditioning, suddenly a conditioned response will come back. So let's just say we've extinguished a behavior, and a year or two later, there's a bell that rings and the dog suddenly salivates. That is because once you've learned something, it's always in you, and spontaneously it could come out. So spontaneous recovery is the return of a conditioned response without having further conditioning. There's a famous experiment in learning psychology known as the Little Albert experiment. So in Little Albert's case, there was a psychologist, John Watson and Rosalie Rayner, who wanted to see whether or not they could condition fear in babies. So they took this little boy who was only 9 months old, and they decided to see if they could make him fear a rat. Because the truth is, a rat is a neutral stimulus to a 9-month-old. They don't know to fear a rat. Fearing a rat or a snake or a spider is all a conditioning. You've learned to do that if you're afraid of those things. Many people are afraid of dogs through learning, through their experiences. So they did the same thing that Pavlov did with the dogs with 9-month-old little Albert. So they had to figure out what's something that's naturally fear-causing for a baby. Loud noises. So they banged on a steel bar with a hammer, and of course, Albert jumped. He started to cry, and he was afraid because babies don't like loud noises naturally. So you know what they had to do. They had to present that rat and bang that steel bar over and over again so that eventually Albert would become afraid of the rat. So through conditioning, they were able to make Albert fear a rat. So there's a lot of ethical considerations to take into place regarding that situation. There's also two terms called generalization and discrimination. Generalization happens in classical conditioning when a person responds in the same way to something that's similar that they've seen before. In little Albert's case, not only did he become afraid of little white rats, he also became afraid of bunnies or cats because he generalized. He, as a 9-month-old, couldn't differentiate between this small furry thing being a rat and a small furry kitten or a small furry bunny. That's what generalization means. It means you think everything that looks similar is the same. Stimulus discrimination is when you can tell the difference between two things. So if Albert was able to discriminate, he would have been able to tell that this small white furry thing is a rat while this other thing is a cat. That means you can tell the difference between something. The second type of learning that we're going to discuss is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is frequently used between parents and their children because this is learning through voluntary behaviors and consequences. With operant conditioning, we have the reinforcement of behaviors to increase those behaviors or punishment of behaviors to decrease them. So Edward Thorndike did a lot of research with a puzzle box. He said that responses that produce a satisfying effect are more likely to occur again. If a person liked the consequences of something, they're going to do it again. Responses that produce a discomforting effect, they will be less likely to occur. If you don't like the consequence of something, chances are you're not going to do it again. If running a red light gets you a ticket and you don't like paying that fine, you're probably going to stop running red lights. B.F. Skinner was another psychologist who focused on behaviors. And perhaps you've heard of his Skinner box because he also looked at the reinforcement and punishment of behaviors and said, I'm on to something here. He came up with these ideas of shaping and schedules of reinforcement. To shape a behavior is to reward close approximations to the desired behavior. If I want a child to say please and thank you when they receive something, then I'm going to tell them, say please and thank you after I give you the lollipop. But as they're learning how to do this, I'm going to hand them the lollipop. And if at first they just say please or peas, like many kids do, I'm going to say, oh, good job. And then the next time they forget and they say thank you, I know that they're trying to get to where they're supposed to be so that eventually they have good manners and I have shaped that behavior. A reinforcer, when it comes to operant conditioning, is something that strengthens a behavior that follows it. Reinforcement can be either positive or negative. So when we reinforce something, we want the behavior to occur in the future. If reinforcement is positive, then I'm going to add something. Let's just say you make a good grade in your class and you pat yourself on the back. That's positive reinforcement. Let's just say you graduate and you buy yourself a car. That's positive reinforcement. You are giving yourself a reward. You're adding something on after a good behavior. Negative reinforcement has to do with also strengthening a behavior, because reinforcement is always strengthening something. But if you have negative reinforcement, you want to remove something that's unpleasant. Remove something you don't like. For example, if your house smells, you will increase your cleaning behavior in order to remove the unpleasant smell, because you don't want that smell to exist anymore. When it comes to operant conditioning, sometimes there can be different schedules of reinforcement. A fixed interval schedule of reinforcement is when somebody is rewarded every hour for doing something. For example, if you have a job that you work, you get $12 an hour for doing that job. So you're paid on a fixed interval schedule. Variable interval schedule is if somebody is rewarded after a changing random amount of time. Would anybody like to have a job that they didn't know how much they were going to make an hour? Would you be okay if your boss said, after you work 5 hours, I'm going to pay you $20. And then when you work another 2 hours, I'll pay you 5 more bucks. It changes. If it's a variable interval schedule, it's going to be at random, changing amounts of times. A fixed ratio schedule is to reward somebody after a certain number of targets. So when you work your job, you are paid $12 an hour, but you receive your paycheck on a fixed ratio schedule. You get paid every 2 weeks or every 1 week. Variable ratio schedule is to reward something after a randomly chosen instance. And none of us want to get paid on a variable ratio schedule. You want to know when you're going to get your paycheck so that you can pay your bills, so that you can plan for your life. And if sometimes you got paid every week, sometimes you got paid every month, sometimes you got paid every 2 weeks, on a variable ratio schedule, you would not be able to properly plan for your life. Now let's talk about punishment, because with operant conditioning, not only do you have reinforcement, you also have punishment. Punishments are supposed to have the opposite effects of reinforcement. Remember again, positive means to add something, but in the case of punishment, you are adding something that's unpleasant. Whereas with reinforcement, you're adding something that is pleasant. For negative punishment, you're still taking away something, but this time you're taking away something that's desirable. So, positive punishment, an example would be if a child receives, you add a spanking because they misbehaved. Negative punishment would be, I'm going to take away your cell phone or your car because you were disobedient. And this, when you punish something, you don't want those behaviors to occur in the future. We also have the third type of learning, which is observational learning. This is when a person learns a new behavior from watching or imitating others. Observational learning is also sometimes called modeling or social learning. There's a popular experiment in observational learning known as the Bobo doll experiment. And in this experiment, Albert Bandura another behavioral psychologist. He put adults in a room with a Bobo doll, which was kind of like a boxing doll. Adults went in the room and they punched, they kicked, they slapped the Bobo doll, and he had children in a room with a one-way mirror watching the adults. After a period of time, he had those children go into the room and just ask them to wait there for a moment, or they can play if they wanted. And what do you think the children did? They punched and kicked and slapped the Bobo doll the same way they'd watched adults, which tells us that children or people learn by watching others. That's much of the reason why children do the same things their parents do. So if we think about it, what biologically is going on when people learn? What's going on in their brain? Research has told us that there's something called mirror neurons, which tell us how people can imitate others. It's through mirror neurons that people are able to show empathy and care and concern for other people, because various areas of the brain that are activated in people who are experiencing pain are also activated in people who view that pain. If you look at the figure 6.22, you can see the baby mimicking everything the parent is doing because they're watching the parent. And that's everything you need to know about the learning unit. Please make sure that you also read the chapter.